So the next thing I'm going to do is to apply the facing. So I've cut my facing pieces out. This one's cut on the fold, and this one, there's 2 pieces that I've cut. You could apply interfacing to these. You would normally apply interfacing to a facing, but I'm going to leave it off for this sample. So again, I've cut little snips for my notches for the shoulder seams and for the neckline. So matching the notches on the front and back, I've just pinned the shoulder seams of the facing, so it will look like that when it's flat. And I'm just going to sew 1.5 centimetres across here, pink the edges and press those flat. So my facing piece has been stitched and seam allowance is pinked and seam allowance is pressed open. So I'm now ready to apply that to the neckline. So I'm going to match my facing to the neckline. So I'm going to apply it on top of the collar. So the collar's sort of sandwiched in between the actual garment and the facing. So I've got right sides together. I'm going to match where I've got my notches. So those notches there will match. The shoulder seam should match. Those notches at the front should match. So I'm going to pin those in place. Okay, so the facing is now all pinned in place, and I can go to the machine and sew this with 1.5 centimetres seam allowance. So I'm stitching this in place, 1.5 centimetres seam allowance, and I'm going to sew that all the way around. So now the facing's been stitched on, I can take the pins out and then I can trim the seam allowance, clip inside, and I could layer the seam allowance a little bit as well. So I'm going to trim the seam allowance, so I'm going to cut about half off all the way along. So I'm cutting through all the layers at this stage. And the facing layer, I can trim that a little bit shorter so that one's not quite as wide as the rest. And that just reduces the bulk rather than having sort of 4 lots of fabric. Now if this had interfacing on, it would obviously reduce a bit more of the bulk because this piece would be a bit thicker. So now I've trimmed and layered my seam, I'm going to put some notches in around the curves so that when I turn it to the inside it's going to sit better. So I don't need to do it on the straight bits, but where I've got curves I can just cut right up to that stitch in. Okay, now the next stage is to understitch, and to do that I'm going to be stitching through the facing and through the seam allowance. So as I stitch, I'm going to sew from this end. I stitch with the right side of the facing facing me, just cut that thread, and I'm going to sew about here where that pin is. So I'm going to stitch all the way around, and this line of stitching, the understitching, will help that facing to sit to the inside, and it won't be seen. So all you'll see is a non-stitched edge here, and this bit will be stitched. So I'm going to understitch. I'm going to stitch about 3mm away from the seam line here, and I'm stitching through the facing. I'm going to catch the seam allowance on the underneath, and I'm going to go all the way around. And as I say, I'm going to pull that over flat to make sure I haven't got sort of this bit here pleating or falling over. So now I've got the understitching in place all the way along. The next stage is to turn that underneath, press that flat, and then pink the long edge of that facing. So I have now pressed the facing towards the inside. I've pinked the edge of the facing, and you can see that understitching helps that facing to stay to the inside, but it doesn't show on the right side, it only shows on the facing on the inside. I've also pinked the edge of the back edge and the bottom edge of my sample as well to stop it from fraying. So I just need to put some hand stitching here where the facing meets the shoulder seam, so I can just put some hand stitching just through the seam allowances to keep those together. So I've threaded a needle, just going to tie a knot in one end. And then I just want to place some stitches here to hold that in place. I'll leave the knot underneath. I'm just going to over sew. And then put a few more stitches in the other side of the shoulder seam. So I'm just stitching through the seam allowances, that won't show on the right side, and it will just hold that facing in place, stop it poking out from underneath. And then I'll do the same on the other side, just here. Okay, so that's my finished sample. So it includes quite a few different techniques. So we've got the set-in sleeves, we've got the straight cuff, I've got the elastic casing using bias binding to create a bit of a feature on a sleeve, and I've also got an elastic casing to create a cuff. We've got the Peter Pan collar, and we've got a neckline facing around the inside.